Hello everyone, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Mic on Hour. We are a mining consultancy that has provided independent professional advice to mining companies, providers of capital, law firms, and government agencies for over 30 years. Staffed by senior industry consultants with extensive international experience, we are here to discuss relevant topics for the benefit of our mineral industry followers. And now, here is your host, Micon's Mineral Resource Specialist, Alan San Martin.
Hello everyone, I'm Alan San Martin. We are happy to have you here in another episode of the Mic on Hour. I'd like to begin with our sustainability statement. At Micon, we work with our clients to promote responsible mining and to integrate the principles of sustainability into their mining projects. In today's episode, we will talk about the importance of density. We will discuss this topic, and at the end, we will have some time to allow our audience joining us on Zoom to ask questions. We will also provide some information if you want to follow up about your project with us. So, I'm here today with our co-host and colleague, Liz de Klerk. She's joining us from our Norwich office in the UK. Liz is the CEO, Managing Director, and Senior Geologist at Micon UK. Hello, Liz. How are you doing?
Hi, Alan. I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm so happy that we are talking about density. If I can ask you to start this conversation, what is rock density and why it's important to measure?
Well, every object has a density, not just rocks. And density is basically the mass of an object, how much it weighs according to its size, or the mass according to a volume. And rock density is often measured according to grams per cubic centimeter, and it is intrinsically linked specifically with rock types and mineral resource estimation to the porosity of a rock and the moisture content of a rock. And it's important because you need your density to be able to measure your mineral resources. Mineral resource estimation, as everybody knows, includes taking a grade and a tonnage. In order to get that tonnage, you need a volume and a density. And a huge amount of time and effort and money is spent working out the grade and estimating the volume. And density is often completely overlooked. And if you get your density wrong, your tonnage will be wrong, your resources will be wrong. That's why it's important, and that's why we're talking about it today.
Excellent. So what are the different density measurements methods commonly used in mineral exploration?
There are lots of different ways of measuring density, and it really depends on the type of deposit you're trying to measure, whether you've got core samples, rock chip samples, whether you're sampling a tailings dump or a stockpile. It depends whereabouts you are in the stage of a study, whether you're doing greenfields exploration, whether you are trying to do a pre-feasibility study, or if you're in detailed engineering and you literally, your next step will be starting opening a mine. Probably the most commonly used and easily accessible density measurement for exploration geologists in the field would be the Archimedes method, which is the water displacement, of which there are many different methods. I think there's 4 or 5 different water displacement methods. But that's basically where you take your rock sample, you weigh it in air, then you weigh it in water, and using a very simple calculation, using those samples, you would get your density.
Should I put the slide?
Sorry?
Should I put the slide now?
You can put the slide on. Yeah, okay. You can put my slide on. So this is a very, very primitive way of doing an Archimedes method. I'm not going to name and shame anybody, but I did take this photograph. And this was a project where they had not thought about doing their density measurements until the very last minute. And we rushed off, and we were in a very remote place, and it was hard to find any equipment, but we managed to find some kitchen scales and a plastic bucket and a net that actually had oranges in it. And using that basic equipment, we set up this density measurement station so we could do our Archimedes method.
Okay. So we hear the terms specific gravity, bulk density. Which one is better and why?
Well, the specific gravity is actually a bit of a misnomer in the mineral resource world, because specific gravity isn't the mass of an object according to its volume. Specific gravity is actually a ratio, and it's the
Hmm.
ratio of the rock density to the ratio of water, specifically water at 4 degrees Celsius. Specific gravity and relative density are the same thing. They're both ratios, and they're not really used. Well, they're not used and not important in mineral resource estimation. What we're interested in and what is important and what the topic of our conversation today is about bulk density. And bulk density can be reported in situ, i.e., it has its moisture. The rock has its moisture content still, or the dry bulk density. Um, Drying a sample is a whole other issue that exploration geologists have to take into consideration.
Yeah. Well, on that matter, if you can discuss what are the best practices to actually take a good measurement of density.
Yeah. So, and this
So,
is also alludes back to my photo of our makeshift density measurements. You know,
mhm,
if you read technical papers or papers from professionals at universities, there are really very um, preferred methods of taking density that make sure you get absolutely the best density measurements and readings, but that's not always very practical when you're in the field, you're on a tight budget, it's either pouring with rain and you're in a rainforest, or it's super dry and dusty and you're in a desert. So you've got to do the best you possibly can. You need to try and dry, if you're assuming you're using core or rock chips, you need to try and make sure your sample is at least dry and hasn't been left out to the elements to try and get that dry bulk density sample. But what's also really important is the representativity of your sample. You know, if you imagine you going to be drilling through a whole bunch of oxidized, friable, porous material, then into more solid sort of primary sulfide ore or whatever, you're going to be lean towards doing your density measurements on your easier samples, i.e. your solid core samples, but that's not going to be representative because you also need to know what your oxidized friable material is. Um,
mhm.
so you really need to make sure that your density measurements are taken throughout your sample suite to get that representativity. Likewise, coming back to the moisture issue, with very porous or friable rocks, you do need to try and make sure that when you submerge your sample in water, it's not taking on all of the water, which is going to skew your density measurement. So,
Yeah.
the sort of best practice is to dip it in wax to completely confine it within that wax seal so no water can get in. But that's not always possible, especially because people forget about density. So it's a last minute, oh, we must do this. What a lot of people do is actually wrap it in, I'd say cling wrap, plastic wrap, glad wrap, in,
Okay.
in, in plastic wrap to try and keep that moisture content. Yeah.
All right. So, um, in Mycon, we do a lot of technical reports. We that's our what we specialize in, writing 43101 and JORC codes. So, are there any requirements for these codes? Or also, what are the density measurements amount of data to be enough to support a resource estimate?
Yeah, the codes, which are all sort of, most of them are all based on the Crisco code template. They're really very vague, and they leave it wide open for the competent or qualified person to
Mhm.
make the decision about what type of density measurements are taken, how it's reported, and whether it's representative enough. So the codes do state specifically, mostly in Table 1, you must describe the type of bulk density that's been taken and what your methodology was, but it doesn't say what the actual requirements are for it to be compliant, to ensure that it's representative. They don't tell you a number of samples, out of like 1,000 samples, that 10%, for example, should be taken. They leave that down to the competent person. Perhaps that's something that the code should actually consider in the future when they're making their next updates, because although the codes are on about, materiality, transparency, and competence, that might be leaving it a bit too wide open to slip through some gaps when it is such an important thing that gets ignored.
Right. So, in that regard, what is the Micron final word of advice when it comes to density data?
Well, it really does amaze me how many people I know that do ignore density, and I really think it is a huge mistake. People love to blame geologists. I'm a geologist. We're always at the starting end of resource projects, and if things go wrong, it's the geologist that gets blamed. So it's up to the geologist and the competent person or qualified person to make sure those density measurements are done properly and representative of the deposit. And if you put garbage in, you'll get garbage out. So it's a very, very important measurement to take.
Yeah, yes, like you said it. I mean, it's very important. So thank you, Liz. Thank you for this advice. And
Pleasure.
and I'm now going to allow our audience to participate with us. And if you can ask any question you would like, please go ahead now.
This is Al Workman. I'm a senior geologist with WGM in Toronto.
Hello.
One of my biggest concerns in doing audits of exploration projects is that many practitioners have used the immersion technique, and the problem that arises is that they're working with a small sample that may not be representative of the mineralization, and if at all possible, we encourage them to actually simply make a physical measurement of a core, calculate the volume, and then make a simple measurement and calculate the density. With a larger sample, you get a much more representative number, and it avoids the messiness of wax coatings and immersion and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's called the caliper method, if I understand what you're saying correctly. And yes, I agree. And I think, a lot of what I've been talking about has maybe been more on the sort of the very first stage kind of exploration. And it's like, don't skip it just because, you haven't thought about it or it's an afterthought. And you're absolutely right. And in best practice, really, there should be 2 density measurements taken, not permanently, but sometimes just like you'd send assay samples to a duplicate laboratory, so you can test your density measurements. And then, for clients that are further down the line and prepared to put in a bit more money, then of course you can just get your laboratory to do your density measurements with a picnometer. But I agree, it is a very gray area, and that's why I think maybe people shy away from it a bit.
Yeah, often, as you've made the point, density measurements are kind of done as an afterthought. And of course, once the core is split, it's almost impossible to get a reliable physical measurement of volumes. And of course, if you're dealing with bedrock samples, well, you've got uneven surfaces, so immersion is really your only option. But if you've got whole core with a little forethought and planning, you can get a fairly reliable density, simply by making those physical measurements. And typically we've found within about 5% of what the ultimate density turns out to be.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
Thank you all. Anyone else would like to ask any questions to Liz? Okay, so I will take that no more questions. So Liz, any final words to finish this episode?
Oh no, I think we have got our point across. Thanks, Alan. There's obviously, if you're really interested in density, we can talk a lot more about it for hours and hours. So I think my contact details will be out there somewhere. So yep, get in touch if you want to talk about it more.
Okay.
It's a pet subject of mine.
Yeah, an important one. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll start ending this broadcast now, and I thank you everyone for listening. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to leave your comments or questions, and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter so you're kept informed on future episodes.